We are in Revelation chapter 18 tonight. The goal for tonight's time will be to basically get into chapter 19. I think that's possible for us. We'll see how that goes. And so really as we kind of begin here, what I'm envisioning in chapter 18 is really we're kind of still in this destruction of Babylon, which was chapter 17. It's kind of been the theme that's been moving us forward in the book of Revelation. And so at the beginning of chapter 18, the angel promises to reveal the punishment to the prostitute. We see that happens, that beginning in chapter 17, verse 1, where the angel begins to do that. That's expanded upon into chapter 18. And then chapter 19, really, I'm going to say, is kind of the heavenly perspective of that punishment. We switch views from the worldly perspective in chapter 18 to a heavenly perspective, the way that the angels, the angelic hosts, the way they see the destruction. So the way that I'm kind of looking at tonight's class is we've got three sections. Section 1 is basically chapters 18, verses 1 through 8. The theme in that section is believers need to leave the city, or they'll be caught up in the punishment of Babylon. The second section is chapter 18, verses 9 through 19, which is really kind of a lament that you see. There's three groups of people. You have a set of kings, you have a set of merchants, and then a set of mariners, seamen. And so they are kind of sorrowful for Babylon's destruction. The third section is chapter 18, verse 20 through 19, verse 5, which is Babylon is doomed. The destruction of Babylon is complete, and God's people are called to rejoice that justice has been brought. I would say that there are some Old Testament connections to tonight's topic. I would probably write down Isaiah 50 and 51 if you're interested in seeing some other parts that are sharing us with some imagery. Okay. Y'all ready?
Ready.
Okay. Mike's joined us, by the way, online. Mike, good to have you.
Thank you.
I guess that was him saying he was glad to be here. So let's look at verses 1 through 8. Would someone read that for us, please? Verses 1 through 8 of chapter 18.
Sure.
Thank you, Laura.
After this, I saw another angel coming down from heaven. He had a great authority, and the earth was illuminated by his splendor. With a mighty voice he shouted, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a dwelling for demons and a haunt for every impure spirit, a haunt for every unclean bird, a haunt for every unclean and detestable animal. For all the nations have drunk the maddening wine of her adulteries. The kings of the earth committed adultery with her, and the merchants of the earth grew rich from her excessive luxuries." Then I heard another voice from heaven say, "Come out of her, my people, so that you will not share in her sins, so that you will not receive any of her plagues. For her sins are piled up to heaven, and God has remembered her crimes. Give back to her as she has given. Pay her back double for what she has done. Pour her a double portion from her own cup. Give her as much torment and grief as the glory and luxury she gave herself. In her heart she boasts, 'I sit enthroned as queen. I am not a widow. I will never mourn.' Therefore, in one day her plagues will overtake her, death, mourning, and famine. She will be consumed by fire, for mighty is the Lord God who judges her."
Thank you, Laura. We start off this chapter and we're introduced immediately to a mighty angel. We've seen a mighty angel before, chapter 10, verse 1. I think it's one of three mighty angels, if I'm not mistaken, in Revelation. But the same idea of a mighty angel is seen in other times in the Old Testament. I forgot the reference for Ezekiel, but I believe it's Isaiah 21 has a reference as well for a mighty angel that's yet again prophesying in Isaiah's account, prophesying the destruction of Babylon. And yet again, that's the destruction for ancient Babylon. So we see this angel making a presence, a mighty voice. And notice in verse 2 what the angel says. "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great." We've shifted tense. in this moment. Previously in Revelation, we've been dealing more with things that are going to happen. And at this point, John is now writing saying that these things have happened, giving us this sense of certainty that it's really going to occur. And yet again, as John's writing, Babylon, which we assume to be, or his application for modern day Rome, Rome was still there. Rome was still present. Even though he is writing in the sense that it's already been destroyed, Rome was still a mighty force to be reckoned with. This is still the middle of persecution and death. So how does the certainty of destruction bring comfort for an early Christian? Or how could it?
Means the sooner we get to see Jesus.
The sooner we get to, we're looking forward even further, the sooner we get to be one with the Father again. Yeah. As you look at verse 2, I want you to try to picture what you see at the ending of verse 2. What do you see?
One of them scary movies with an old castle, and it's got the ghost and the weird things going all around it and creeping in and out and creepy sounds.
Creaks. I like how you mentioned ghosts, and yet again, we kind of have this unclean spirit. Does anyone else's translation say a haunt? For yours does? Okay, a haunt. So yeah, this ghost town spookiness. What else? Greg, I saw you light up, but what else? What else when you're reading the verse 2, what else do you see?
It becomes deserted. It becomes, we wouldn't want to live there.
Mhm.
Is basically what it's saying. It has become, and I think you have to look at, with the words, every foul bird and every foul and hateful beast. I think maybe you might have to go back to the Old Testament and look at their food laws. You know, to think foul birds, nasty anyway.
Mine says unclean.
Yeah.
Detestable beast or unclean beast. And so yet we're looking at this place. I like the way you summarize it. This is not a place that you want to move your family to. Has anyone ever been to a ghost town? What was it like?
It was a tourist trap, basically. I mean, it was Cody, Nevada, I think. And there was nothing there but a bunch of people walking around. Just old-timey town.
It's not the place I mean, it might be something you could drive through, but even then in driving through it, you said it's a tourist trap. How many of us want to go to a tourist trap?
Yeah.
This is a place, or Babylon has become the place no one wants to go to. It's, I wrote down ghost town spooky. Because as I'm reading this, that's the feeling you get. Chernobyl. Oh, that's a powerful one. Chernobyl. That was was it 84 or 86 when the nuclear reactor melted down there, and they've got, I forget how many thousands of acres now. That it's eerie. And that's the way that Babylon is depicted now. We move into verse 3. And it says that all these nations, they've drunk wine of passion, sexual immorality. They've grown rich with power and our luxuries and our living. As I look at verse 3 is really kind of, in my opinion, leading us into the next section, or at least the next little song, if you will. Because how many people found their wealth in what was Babylon? How many people built their livelihood off of the rich indulgences that existed there, off of the tourist trap that even it was? So we come to verse 4. Come out of her, my people, lest you take part of her sins. This phrase is used in Jeremiah 51:45 and also in Isaiah 48 and verse 20. It finds its way into a New Testament idea, though. So 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 14. Come out of her, my people, lest you take part in her sins. 2 Corinthians 6, verse 14. Do not be yoked together with, does anyone know the word?
Unbelievers.
Unbelievers. If you didn't, it's not a test. I just wanted to see. For what do righteousness and wickedness have in common? Or what fellowship can light have with darkness? Jump down to verse 17. Come out from them and be separate, says the Lord. Touch no unclean thing, and I will receive you. And that's, my Bible has the reference being to Revelation 18 and verse 4. How would that apply to us today? Come out of her, my people, lest you take part in her sins.
Means we got to separate ourselves. We can't, if we go around hanging out with, people who do the very things that we're trying to abstain from, we could fall into the trap of it becoming some kind of commonplace, and then we could find ourselves engaging in that. But we have to set ourselves apart, because if we're hanging out with that type of people, then no one's going to look at us as anything different.
I think what I see here is, the reason I ask that is there's two ideas. Verse 4 and following, John could be telling people that when you see certain signs in Babylon, in Rome for that day, you need to flee the city. So some people take this as a literal fleeing of a location. Much like when Jesus said, when you see these signs, was that Matthew 25? When you see these signs, head for the hills. I hope no one's pregnant. I hope no one's nursing. I hope no one's lame. So some people choose to interpret this text that way. The other interpretation, and the one that I'm personally going to favor, is don't look like those people.
But the entanglement is really hard to distinguish sometimes. Economic factors, your financial stuff, it gets all tangled up.
Which brings us to the question for us. We are taking the approach that John is writing about Rome. How many Christians made their wealth off of the luxuries and the sensualities that was Rome? But let's bring this to 21st century America. What wealth has been made by the United States? How have we as Christians enjoyed that wealth? And has that also caused us, as you said, an entanglement, I'm going to use that word, with some things that may not be moral, that may not be godly?
Entertainment, we sometimes excuse a movie. It's got a good story on it.
Ignore these parts.
Yeah.
I want to talk about that in a minute. Not that I don't want to talk about it now, but
Okay.
I actually talk about the entertainment industry, sports, the sport industry. I forget, there's one other that I wrote down, but
good.
I want to talk about those in a minute. We come to verse 6, though. We see here that I'm going to say that just as Babylon has made others drink of her cup of idolatry, of adultery, now we see that she's being forced to drink her own cup of punishment, if you will. Now that lends us back to chapter 14, verse 8, and chapter 17 yet again. We come now to verse 7, and we see that the sins of Babylon are more so listed. She glorifies herself. She lived in luxury. So give her a like measure of torment and mourning. She said in her heart, I sit as a queen, I am no widow, and mourning I shall never see. So the sins that seem to be portrayed in this text are that Babylon had this place of self-glory. I've done it on my own, this excess, and this idea of pride. And moving on in through some of this text, we see that verse 8, for this reason, her plagues will come in a single day. I'm thinking this lends us back to Isaiah 47, where let me just jump us back there for a brief moment. Isaiah 47, verse 7. I'm going to read verses 7 through 9. 7 and 8 are going to be similar to what we just read. And then verse 9 is going to jump us to this punishment idea. You said, I am forever the eternal queen, but you did not consider these things or reflect on what happened. Now then, listen, you lover of pleasure, lounging in your security and saying to yourself, I am, and there is none beside me. I will never be a widow or suffer the loss of children. Verse 9, both of these will overtake you in a moment, on a single day, loss of children and widowhood. They will come upon you in full measure, in spite of your many sorceries and all your potent spells. So yet here in Isaiah's account, we see the destruction of what was ancient Babylon. John, using similar language in Revelation to describe, or to at least picture towards Rome. And we see yet again the sins listed are this idea of pride, glory, and excess. If I look at the first 8 verses, what I'm seeing, at least what I would share, is that God alone deserves glory. There is nothing that we can put our glory in or our strength in besides God. I think in what we see here is that Babylon is trying to hang on to whatever glory and honor there may be, arrogance and self-sufficiency. But those are the very things that the Bible condemns with that throughout scriptures. Job 40, Psalm 5, Proverbs 16, Isaiah 2, Matthew 23, and so on. I think even in the book of Revelation, we see the Laodiceans. If you can remember, this was Revelation chapter 3 and verse 17. The sin of Laodicea was that I am rich. I have acquired wealth, and I do not need a thing. Pride comes when? With the fall. And it comes before the judgment. Any thoughts on verses 1 through 8?
It's a reminder of how those words, the queen and not a widow and I'll never see grief, that even plays back into the book of Judges, where Sisera's mother is sitting at the window and looking out, thinking about, jail has driven a stake through his head, so he's not coming home.
Thank you for that, Gray. Well, I even asked the question, and not for us necessarily to delve into. Maybe this is something for you to ponder over. If we delve into it, that's fine. But is it possible that the American culture, the American society has said or is saying the same things? I'll leave that to your own thoughts. Chapter 18, verses 9 through 19. As we continue in the text here, we see this is really the part where we come in contact with 3 groups of people. The first group is the king that's listed at verse 9, and the kings of the earth. I think that when we start with these kings, to ask who they are really it's pointing us to all the kings that have been subservient to, in John's case, Rome, but in the greater case, Babylon being the presence of evil. And so that's defined further by the next line of who's committed sexual immorality and lived in luxury with her. I think that what we see is this idea of luxury is anything that's placed higher than God, when stuff has become your God. We move into verse 10, and it says, they will stand far off. They fear her torment. Why do they stand far off? Why aren't they going to help?
Perhaps the collapse is beyond help.
And they know it.
Yeah. I mean, you can't do anything about it.
I like that idea. What else?
And then, of course, the obvious part is they don't want to be caught up in the actual destruction either.
What happens if you send your people in and all of a sudden they're caught in the destruction too? All of a sudden, and here's the thought that even comes to my mind. If let's say I fell into some sort of hardship, some sort of destructive life pattern, who would be the people who would come to try to help? The people who are my truest friends. I would hope that those would be the people who would at least come and try to help. So what does it say when the people who were all in this together are all of a sudden keeping their distance?
Well, you know it, like the entertainment industry, you have an actor fall out of favor, then all of a sudden everybody's jumping ship. He don't have friends anymore. They just all been scattered. We don't want anything to do with you. I never did like that guy. You know, I mean, it's just.
It's amazing how we can overlook, I'm going to say, the sins of a person. I'm putting that in quotes because I think there are times, but I think there are times where we also look and say, oh, well, they're really not that bad. Once they do something that's bad, we bring all the past up to throw at them.
Yep.
I think what we're looking at is we're seeing a surrounding kings who, one, I think primarily they don't want to get wrapped up in it. Two, I don't think they were really ever connected. This was purely business stuff.
Mm-hmm.
They might have lived like they were best friends, like they were BFFs, but they weren't. The moment came that Rome started to fall, or in Babylon's case, Babylon started to fall, they're cutting their ties. And we see even, I think the biblical reason comes in verse 11. And this is where the merchants come in. The merchants are weeping and mourning. Why are they weeping and mourning?
Nobody buys their cargo.
So let's translate that to one step down. What does that mean? Why are they mourning? No one's buying their stuff, which means what for them?
Lack of stuff, lack of money.
They were friends because they do business
Yes.
because there was money to be made. And now there's not money to be made there. And they may have just had a ship sail from India with all sorts of precious stuff on it. But now it's not going to be able to be sold. So I go back to the kings and I say, why would the kings keep their distance? Well, the same reason the merchants are. There's no longer money to be made here.
And it might also be, if we think of how some of the treaties were made in the Old Testament, the kings were actually conquered, but within that conquest, they were able to have some sort of freedom, some sort of stuff to do whatever.
Yeah.
But now that the ruling power is truly gone, you know,
This may be a way out.
yes,
Good way to look at it. So we have next this list of things. This list is I don't know if I'd say iconic or symbolic or representative. Maybe that's a word of Ezekiel 27 verse 4. Matter of fact, this list of stuff, no one buys their cargo of gold, silver, jewels, pearls, fine linen, purple cloth, silk, scarlet cloth, all kinds of scented wood, all kinds of articles of ivory, all kinds of articles of costly wood, bronze, iron, marble. The list goes on and on. This is Ezekiel 27, verse 13, though. Where am I? Ezekiel 27, verse 13. Greece, Tubal, and Meshech did business with you. They traded human beings and articles of bronze for your wares. Look at the very end of verse 13. What is the last commodity listed there?
Oils and foods.
Go a little bit further than that, Laura, or whoever sees it.
Human lives.
Slaves. Mike, you said human lives. This brings, I think, for at least our generation, our time, a tough point, maybe a reality, that slavery has been a problem for beyond our time period. And here we have an example where a person is a slave. 1 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 10. Find verse 10 real quick. For the sexually immoral, those that practice homosexuality, for slave traders. So that's listed among the sins here in 1 Timothy 1. What does it say about Rome when a human soul becomes nothing more than a commodity equal to a horse or a chariot or gold? Not to ignore even our own past, our own history as a country. But what does it say? When a human soul is the equivalent of cattle. And here we see that's a topic that's brought up of charge against Babylon. We move into 14 really through 17. These songs, if you will, of destruction are still going about. And we come down to verse 17 where we see that in 17, the third group of people is brought up. They're the shipmasters and seafaring men. And notice where they stand. They're standing far off. They're not wanting to get sucked into this vacuum either. These are the same people who have made just gobs of money in servicing Rome and bringing in Rome or Babylon or whatever. They're the ones who've made tons of money by bringing imports to the great power that was. And yet now they see destruction. They want nothing to do with it. This is the very end of verse 19. Alas, alas, for the great city where all who had ships at sea grew rich by her wealth, for in a single hour she's been laid waste. What we see in these three accounts, the king, the merchants, and the shipmasters, is those who grew rich off of Babylon. The sins that Babylon committed are the same people who will also share in her destruction. As Babylon falls, the industry that supports her will fall as well. Which brings us to some thoughts. Probably the easiest thought comes the danger of the love of money. The love of money is what? Can anyone remember the verse?
The root of all evil.
Root of all kinds of evil. Yeah, root of evil. We've seen this idea of luxury, of commercial goods, be very present in this chapter. And that was something that Babylon was known for. Yet again, that's something that Rome is known for. Which brings a modern point, is that something that we are known for? Jesus would teach that those who misplace their hope into things will be deeply disappointed. Matthew chapter 6, verse 19. that we must choose between serving God and serving money, Matthew chapter 6, verse 24. And I think rather than divorcing these ideas, separating these ideas of I must love God or I must love money, I think we are encouraged as Christians to see the good stewardship, the habits and the practices that we can possess something, but that God ultimately owns us. The scriptures would tell us to take care of the poor and to honor God with material possessions. And I can't help but think that maybe as a people who are being called to live apart from the world, our ability to be good stewards is one way that we can differentiate ourselves from the rest of the world. The second point that I think must be talked about is the idea that human beings are not a commodity. Gold, silk, wood, those items are created items by God, but they do not possess the image of God. Humanity is different. When God created man, he looked at it and said, it is very good because it possesses the image that God of God himself. I talked about our past in some ways as an American culture, and not that that's unique just to the United States. We see those practices of slave handlers around the world, even still today, in some of the most gruesome ways, but this is where I wanted to hit on this topic, Greg. But let's think about other ways of slavery that do exist that we might not often talk about. What about the adult entertainment business, or those that are wrapped up in the sins of pornography? The idea of entertainment is one thing, but the idea that the human being is nothing more than an object degrades the quality of what God put within us. To think about the sports industry, where we care more about the player's performance value than who the player actually is, or the quality or character that exists within him. Or maybe even in our own personal desire to pay the lowest price for something, that we would be willing to keep others impoverished so that we could get a good deal. I think that God's judgment on Babylon is harsh because of the enormous value and worth that he places on humanity, which then puts within me the question or the challenge, do I place that same value in other people? Thoughts or comments? I've talked a lot in the last few verses, so.
The situations get complicated. You deal with people when you get hurt by people, and it gets messy. So for that person, you may not see their value.
Mm.
Then think about things that one of the biggest days of sex trafficking in the United States is Super Bowl Sunday. You think of all the fascination that we have with the Super Bowl. You want to hear about that. Right? We even have a little bit of it with the Derby. Again, it's not thought about. In the situation with is it Sudan, where the people have been taken as slaves, and
They're mining, aren't they, or something like that?
Yeah. No. It's,
What we find, or at least what I think we find, or at least for me, this, go, Mike, were you going to say something?
Yeah, sorry. I think it would get a little more practical than that. When we kind of treat a waitress or a waiter like a servant, and just dismiss their humanity because they're serving us. I mean, things of that nature.
that's close. That's really close to home. Yeah. Or the janitor who picks the trash up.
You know, Mike, you're kind of you put us right where I was wanting us to go. We often think of the crimes against humanity as something that exists in other places. I'll be honest, the hard part in my study on this particular section was realizing that there are times in my own life where I may not value humanity the way that I should. It'd be far easier to say, well, that person doesn't matter, or they're less than me. And granted, the atrocities past, the atrocities that exist today, still exist. That doesn't nullify our responsibility to be a part, to have a voice against those things. But I may not be able to change the Sudan. I may not be able to change what happened prior to the 1950s or even in the slavery of America. I can't change those things. But what I can change are how I treat people today. And the question then comes back to really what happened in verse 3 of the chapter, where we're being encouraged to flee Babylon. And I said that I take the approach that this isn't necessarily a physical fleeing, as in we have to leave the country, but more so the fleeing of how do I leave what can so easily suck us in. So Mike, your example was a great one. How can I treat the waitress or waiter with the utmost of respect and humanity? How can I treat the janitor with the utmost of respect and humanity? How can I ensure that every person in my life feels as valued as I can possibly make them? That is something I can't change. And that is something I can do. And when it comes to things that, my example or my thought is I buy things from China because it's cheap. Even though that puts people in China in a hard place, I don't really think about it because I got a really good deal on that shirt. Maybe I need to think a little bit more holistically, a little more humanely. Maybe I need to consider those things more.
But sometimes when we take that humane approach, we actually put those people in danger too, because they may not have anything to eat if we stop buying the products. So, yeah.
It's never an easy question, is it? Or an easy answer.
No. And I don't remember what particular point that was brought out for me. I mean, it was something, there was some protest about buying stuff from somewhere. And then the folks that pointed that out, that the kid may not have something to eat if you take that away. So
there's not easy answers, but I do think there is something we can do. There's a change we can make. I'm called to live in this world, but not of this world. That's a Jesus teaching at the end of John. And I think that one of the things we learn here most, that I find most applicable, is this sorry, everybody, is this idea of how do I treat other people? Making sure that when I have a friend who falls on hard times, am I the one that races in to help? How I treat the wait staff, how I treat those people who serve me. Well, we didn't make it into chapter or verse 20, but we will next week, I suppose. Any other comments before we close out for tonight? I know, we'll get there. Thank y'all very much for joining in tonight. Glad to have y'all online. For those of you who are online, I'm glad to be able to be here in person for those of you who are in person. And we will sure look forward to picking up next week. We'll pick up at verse 18, verse 20, chapter 18, verse 20.